Number 8. Nuclear-powered submarines. The Cold War ended in the early 1990s, yet the competition between the US and Russia for military superiority seems to be alive and well. It's making some people wonder if the threat of nuclear warfare between the two superpowers still lurks, waiting for tensions to reach a boiling point. The Russian Navy is currently working to replace its outdated Soviet-era fleet with a new line of nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. Interestingly, plans for the updated fleet, known as Bore-class submarines, were already in the works before the Soviet Union fell. Design work began during the mid-80s, and construction on the first vessel began in 1996. In 2013, news agencies reported that the Russian Navy will use its Bore-class submarines to resume strategic patrols in southern latitudes that had not seen a Russian presence in 2 decades. The vessels are part of the Navy's nuclear deterrent force, which also consists of 4 newly developed Khabarovsk-class submarines. Each Khabarovsk-class sub will carry 6 nuclear-powered drone torpedoes that are capable of traversing across oceans to strike coastal cities and military bases. These bombs are capable of causing 10 times as much damage as the bomb dropped on Hiroshima at the end of World War II. It's probably safe to say that even Russia wants to avoid launching a nuclear attack, which would likely be met with an equally or more destructive response from the US. Nobody truly wins in a situation like that, but it's still scary to think about what might happen if things escalate between the two countries, which are currently at odds over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Number 7. It starts with words. The United States and North Korea have never had a good relationship. Our strained history dates back to the Korean War and is perpetuated by America's continued support of capitalist South Korea, among other factors. From a young age, school children in the Hermit Kingdom are taught that Americans are murderous imperialists who started the Korean War. But anti-American propaganda is not the only thing fueling the tensions between these longtime adversaries. Shortly after entering office in 2018, former President Donald Trump made some rather outspoken comments about North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. Trump wasted no time escalating his insensitive banter to verbal cheap shots, calling the nuke-obsessed dictator a little rocket man, and finding other wildly unprofessional ways to taunt him. Kim responded by calling Trump a mentally deranged dotard. The obnoxious tit-for-tat somehow led to plans for the two to sit down and have a civilized talk about how the two countries can move forward peacefully. They signed a historic document agreeing to build a lasting and stable peace regime on the Korean peninsula. Many criticized the move as a vain attempt to improve relations with the country, especially after a verbal back and forth nearly brought things between the US and North Korea to a boiling point shortly before the meeting. The takeaway? If tensions erupt between the two countries, it could very easily start with words. Number 6. A new Cold War. A new era of fear and uncertainty is setting in as Russian forces storm the Ukrainian border in a long-feared assault of missile and gunfire. Countless onlookers around the world are wondering what the future will bring, if their country will get involved in the crisis, and what types of effects it could have on the rest of the world. One major question that keeps coming up is if the United States will directly participate in the fighting. So far, President Biden has vowed to remain uninvolved in the conflict. But he has escalated the U.S. military presence in several European countries, sending troops and equipment to Germany, Poland, Estonia, Romania, and elsewhere, vowing to defend every inch of NATO territory against Russian aggression. The U.S. is among several nations that have imposed hefty economic and trade sanctions against Russia, where the ruble has plummeted to an all-time low due to the invasion. But it'll take some time to tell whether these sanctions will be effective in stopping further conflict. Staying out of Ukraine may help to avoid direct combat between America and Russia, but at the very least, the U.S. is heavily involved from the sidelines, and there's speculation that we could find ourselves entangled in another Cold War type of standoff with the fellow nuclear superpower. It's likely that American soldiers will repopulate bases that the military hasn't used since the early 90s when forces cleared out following the Soviet Union's collapse. These prospects have alarming overtones of the hostilities that lingered for 40 years as the US and Russia vied for military superiority and world dominance. Many are worried, rightfully so, that history is on the brink of repeating itself. Number 5. NATO versus Russia. Because Ukraine is not a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, it is not receiving direct support from NATO forces, even as Russia attempts to take the country by force. Instead, thousands of NATO troops are being dispatched to allied countries in Eastern Europe. If Russia attacks a NATO country, the organization will respond with force. But for now, NATO is refusing to directly participate in the conflict. The decision not to get involved comes after Ukraine expressed an interest in joining the alliance. This is one of the factors that apparently triggered Putin to launch the invasion. Russia has made it clear that it is strongly opposed to Ukraine becoming a NATO country. Speaking with the BBC recently, Ukrainian ambassador to Britain Vadim Pristaiko said that his country was threatened and blackmailed by Russia for its attempt to join the organization. Military experts think that it's unlikely that Russia will invade NATO's eastern flank. As U.S. President Joe Biden pointed out, the military alliance is more united than ever. Article 5 of the NATO treaty outlines the organization's policy that an attack against one member is an attack against all members. And while it has not been formally invoked in this case, Biden and other leaders have made it clear that they are ready and willing to defend their NATO allies on a moment's notice. The alliance was created in 1949 amid growing fears of an attack by Germany or the Soviet Union. Its membership has grown since from 12 to 30 countries, including many former Soviet states and satellite territories. NATO is a powerful organization, and Russia sees it as a national security threat. As Ukraine's future as a sovereign state becomes increasingly jeopardized, the possibility of it becoming the next NATO member is more uncertain than ever. What do you think may happen next? Are you worried about the potential escalation? Share in the comments and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Number 4. It could inspire other conflicts. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has sparked fears of potential conflict among other states with shaky relations. Hours after military vehicles rolled into Ukraine from neighboring Belarus and began advancing toward the capital of Kyiv, officials began voicing their concerns about China's possible plans against Taiwan. That same day, Taiwan's Air Force warned off 9 Chinese aircraft that entered its airspace as part of a military exercise. Taiwanese Foreign Minister Joseph Wu appealed for continued U.S. support, citing an ongoing military threat from China, which claims ownership of the island. Relations between China and Taiwan have long been strained. China views self-ruled Taiwan as a breakaway province that will eventually rejoin the country, while Taiwan sees itself as an independent country. Tensions between the two states have increased in recent years as Chinese President Xi Jinping has said that reunification must be fulfilled. In fact, Taiwan's defense minister said that relations are at their worst point in 40 years. During a virtual event at the McCain Institute for International Leadership at Arizona State University, Foreign Minister Wu expressed the need for the Taiwanese people to be able to defend themselves against mainland forces. He stressed the importance of continued arms sales, military exchanges, shared intelligence, and other assistance from the U.S. as a way to make Taiwan an unattractive target to China. Chinese officials have warned that the country hasn't ruled out using force to bring Taiwan under its control and that it won't tolerate any foreign interference with these measures. What the future holds remains to be seen. Number 3. England versus Russia. The United Kingdom is one of many countries whose citizens are wondering how involved their government will become with the current Russia and Ukraine crisis. Some experts have pointed out that certain European countries may be more hesitant than the U.S. to show aggression toward Russia because they're closer to the country and therefore more in danger of direct hostilities. Additionally, some countries like England have a large influx of Russian wealth from financial and property investments, which means that going to war could severely jeopardize their economy. President Boris Johnson condemned Putin for the violence being waged against Ukraine and announced plans to impose a massive package of sanctions designed to cripple the Russian economy. Much like the U.S., it is Britain's hope that this will be enough to stop the needless attacks that have already killed dozens, including at least one child. But it's possible that the sanctions won't work the way they're intended. They could cause Russia to retaliate against the punishing countries. In the event of an attack against the UK, it would undoubtedly lead to a major war between Russia, Britain, and its NATO allies, including the US. As of right now, this is considered highly unlikely, but the attacks on Ukraine probably won't end anytime soon. The sanctions against Russia won't have an immediate effect. Any damage they do will take time to set in. Plus, Putin probably knew the country would face sanctions and likely has a plan to somehow manage despite any damage they may cause to Russia's economy. In this case, it lessens the possibility that these newly imposed policies will help to put an end to the violence in Ukraine. If sanctions don't work, it begs the question of how far Putin will go in his pursuit to expand his power, and whether the countries that have vowed to avoid direct conflict, such as England and the US, will feel they have no choice but to step in. Number 2. The US versus China. The question of what would happen if the US and China went to war has been asked many times, and the answers have changed dramatically over the years. As Robert Farley pointed out, at one time the only fathomable motivations for a war between the countries would be disputes over Taiwan or North Korea. These are still distinct possibilities, but the number of scenarios that could lead to direct military conflict between China and America has grown in recent years, along with China's expanding interests and capabilities. One likelihood involves China's disputed territorial claims in the East and South China Seas. Recently, Chinese President Xi Jinping told the People's Liberation Army that they should persist in using combat to guide their work. There are numerous different approaches that the U.S. could take if one of these unfortunate scenarios took place. In many cases, it's likely that a great deal of a war would take place in East Asia, giving China the advantage of fighting in familiar and close territory. Attacking China's shipping fleet would be one way for the U.S. to gain an upper hand, depending on the circumstances. This could potentially cripple the country's economic lifelines. Once upon a time, China had a slim chance of defeating the U.S. regardless of where a conflict happened. After years spent building up its military and increasing its war budget, that's no longer the case. Just how much of a threat the country's military would pose to the U.S. is debatable, but it is clearly capable of inflicting some serious damage. Do you consider war between China and the U.S. in the near future a major concern? Tell us in the comments below. Number 1. A second American Civil War. In recent years, Americans have become increasingly divided over social and political issues, including police brutality and other forms of racial inequality, gun control, abortion, allegedly rigged elections, and other things. Things have only become more heated amid stark disagreements on COVID safety protocols and whether these measures are necessary or if they infringe upon our basic freedoms. Many have started to wonder if there's a chance of the United States erupting into a second civil war. To some, it's unthinkable, but there seems to be a growing number of people who see it as a realistic prospect. Earlier this year, President Joe Biden urged the American people to think about whether they want to be the type of nation that accepts political violence as a norm. He posed this question on the one-year anniversary of the deadly insurrection at the U.S. Capitol, which resulted in 5 deaths and hundreds of injuries. Naturally, many people fear that the violent riot marked the beginning of a chapter of civil unrest and conflict that would only worsen. Even the mainstream media began to seriously address the possibility of a civil war. In a country where inequality is ever present, radical groups have emerged with the apparent goal of deepening the divide. Political scientist Barbara Walter, who recently wrote a book on civil wars and has served on the CIA's Political Instability Task Force, told reporters that she's noticed a few telltale signs that the U.S. could be heading in a dangerous direction. One is the increasing tendency for people to organize more along racial, ethnic, or religious lines rather than ideology or specific policies. Another is the fact that by late 2020, 90% of the Republican Party was white, something that in any culturally and ethnically diverse country with a two-party system, the task force would have considered dangerous. So far, the U.S. has managed to avoid another civil war, but there's no telling whether tensions will reach a boiling point. If a war did happen, it would likely take the form of an insurgency among widespread militia groups rather than a centralized and unified force. Though this is a deeply concerning topic, we hope you've gained something out of our coverage. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks so much for spending time with us, and we look forward to sharing more with you in our next video right here on American Eye.